I don't miss those days. They talk about prom days. Did you buy your prom? I'm like, nope, not missing those days at all. I borrowed my cousin's old like from different organizations. We're always advocating, for Tamil nationhood and like those things. But this definitely brings all of the youth and like the community members together and kind of like puts focus on what we need to do to achieve what we want to, right? So I think that's definitely, it's important to have such events. So I think, yeah.
And how do you feel that this has benefited Tamil youth by having this conference and having them attend the conference itself?
I feel like as Tamil youth, like we know, like being in the diaspora, we know like bits and parts of things, right? Like especially if I struggle like from the past. I think this kind of events is important and benefits the Tamil youth because we're able to understand like what's going on currently, which is really important to advocate for like Tamil nationhood. I feel like it's important to advocate for Tamilism when you understand the current situations, not just the past struggle, right? So this like definitely like a lot of activists, a lot of advocacy, like people who do advocacy, they come together and they kind of they've done a lot of groundwork and research. So they definitely understand the current situations and they're giving us that information. So I feel like as Tamil youth, it definitely benefits us to learn what's currently going on. So yeah.
And how do you feel that this conference will benefit the Tamil struggle and how we move forward with our struggle?
I feel like our Tamil, like the struggle and moving forward, the struggle has definitely changed from the last time this conference happened till now. And it's this, I feel like with this, like we come together and we kind of see the different like parts of advocacy that all these people are doing, and we put it together and kind of see like where we can go with it. And it definitely will help us in terms of like understanding what's important and what's not important, because everybody like is advocating for it, but definitely this kind of gives focus on certain issues that we should be focusing on, how we can advocate on those things and like bring it to different levels of advocacy in the diaspora.
And so with the themes of this conference, a lot pertaining to the genocide and how it's interpreted in the community right now and worldwide as well, how do you feel that this can help us making goals in the future, especially with that being a way forward towards freedom and justice for the Tamil community?
With everything going on around the world, I definitely think that this kind of gives us like how to like the kind of focuses on the importance that like for example, like I was just inside and what she was saying, like justice starts with like returning our land to our people. So like those little things is what adds up to our bigger justice. So definitely it kind of like gives us the idea that like we have to focus on little steps before we can, you know, just say like we want the whole thing, but like definitely focus on little things like like displaced people and like returning lands that have been taken away from our people for like decades now, right? So I think we need to like, it kind of gives us the idea that we can set little goals and probably work towards those things as the diaspora, lending a hand to those people there, and we can move forward to, you know, achieving bigger things, right?
And how do you feel that community members around the world can contribute to raising awareness about the Tamil struggle and getting other communities involved? So especially like the Rohingya and the Burmas and everywhere, like around the world, there's so many atrocities that are still happening, especially with Syrians. How can we join together with all the youth and, you know, community members? How can we get together with others? And how do you feel that we can go apart with that?
So I definitely think that our genocide is something that has been hidden from the world for so long, but it isn't something that hasn't been happening around the world. Like you mentioned, all the other countries and all the other groups, right? Like it's definitely been going on, and it's something that unfortunately they have more light than our situation does, but it is up to the youth, right, to definitely bring light to those situations. And you know, like from TYO Canada, we work with Tamil Students Associations in the GTA and stuff. So we definitely, the TSAs, we focus on like being partners with other groups, right? So they're able to share their experiences, and then they find that they have a common ground, right, with genocide, and then they're able to, you know, move forward as a collective group to advocate for genocide.
Okay, awesome. And when it comes to a conference like this, how do you feel that we can get more involvement from our community? Because, of course, this is a conference that's happened after 20 years, and it's such a big change in our community as well. So how can we get more involvement from our community to do more conferences like this, create more research papers, create more articles, and bringing this out to the outer community as well?
I think that like a lot of youth that like are here, and a lot of youth in the community, they're definitely doing a lot of work. They're definitely advocating in any way they can, whether it be through their talents, whether it be through school or like their jobs or something. They're definitely advocating for Tamilam and for the justice for genocide, right? But I feel like these kind of conferences kind of brings everyone together, and like you're saying, I think the Tamil community probably could do a lot more of these and support the young people, because like as the older generation, they've lived through these firsthand experiences, and they have this passion for it. But as the Tamil like youth diaspora, like living in the diaspora, it's I think like having this passion and like being able to like advocate for it, I think that we should do more of these things and appreciate it, and definitely it'll bring light to those things. Like I was inside and I was looking at the paper, and there's so many research papers, right, that I didn't know about till I got here. So yeah.
And how do you feel that we could encourage parents to bring out their students and just enlighten them about what happened and how they could help and how they could go back home and do, some work back home and helping other individuals with widows and children without parents and orphans. How could we help them out, and how could we get parents to take part in that?
So I feel that getting parents involved into what you, as like young people do, letting them know what you're doing, bringing them to these events or something like that will help them, because most of our parents might not be too involved in these things. They just want us to do school. They just want us to, get a better life, the opportunities that they didn't get, right? So I feel like just maybe involving your parents a little bit more into these conferences, or like the things that you do, letting them know about it, telling them the importance of it in today's situation. I feel like that would make a big difference.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Abby, for coming out today, and we'll wrap this up. Thank you. I never asked that questions.
Or into history itself. Partially my answer is in the subtitle, because what I'm really looking at is the elusiveness of a Sri Lankan past and present. And when I say Sri Lankan, I mean the sort of civic notion of nationhood, whereby the values of nationhood are seen as more inclusive, like language, citizenship rights, obligations, and so on and so forth. Basically values that can be learned, that can be ascribed, and are seen thus as more inclusive, as compared to ethnic values that are usually linked to a shared heritage and more exclusive myths and symbols, and so on and so forth. Of course, in Sri Lanka, I think that's very difficult, because we know that the state has been shaped over decades or by the majority community to cater their idea of what the state should look like. So there's this question of whether there's any civic values at all, but that's kind of beyond my talk. Why? Nope. Oh, yeah. So why do I look at history textbooks? Basically, as Dave said, the diffusion of nationalism derives its power by being widely shared by a lot of people, and textbooks are an important part of the socialization process. They are basically how young future citizens learn about the values that are seen as important. So they're both a tool of spreading nationalism, and they're also a representation of the kind of knowledge that should be taught, that should be learned. History, then, in particular, is an important subject because it provides this collective memory to an ideal nation. So it tells the nation how they got to be who they are now, which of course is important when we look at the idea of nationhood being determined by memories, by myths, and so on and so forth. So when I started looking at these textbooks, I went in, well, not knowing an awful much about Sudanese nationalism, or much less than I know now. And I had very little expectations and very little preconceptions, but I did know that textbooks were, standardized textbooks were provided by the government, and that's what I looked at, English versions of these textbooks. And I also know that these textbooks have been criticized quite a lot throughout the 1990s because they were seen to be very biased, ethnically and religiously. They were full of factual errors, of grammar, spelling errors, and so on and so forth. But we also knew that since the late 1990s there were a lot of educational reforms in part to address these these issues and to create textbooks as a tool for social cohesion. And I was kind of curious to see how successful were these educational reforms, how much were the textbooks, what kind of nation were they creating. And here the foreword of the grade 8 textbooks talks about these textbooks being a tool to shape worthy citizens of the country. And I was kind of interested in, well, what do these worthy citizens look like, or should they look like once the textbooks come out? Now, given the constraints on time, I won't be able to talk about all the dimensions, but I'm going to focus on, first of all, these kind of questions of who is this nation that the textbooks talk about, whose history we talk about. And it becomes very clear very quickly that, of course, while they do talk about a Sri Lankan nation, they really look at a Sindhese Buddhist nation. And there's a lot of different ways of how they do that, but I'm going to focus a bit on the ethnic dimension of nationhood, on how they become very exclusive, in my opinion, marginalizing non-Sindhese Buddhists. The first one I want to talk about is the ancientness of the modern nation that is constructed by the textbooks. So what we see for the textbooks, of course, they provide the ancient history, about 2,500 years of Sri Lanka, and they talk about a continuous history, as such linking the present Sindhese Sri Lankan nation to the pre-modern nation, and as such not only creating this continuity between modern-day Sri Lanka and past Sindhese kingdoms, but also reinforcing the use of ethnic labels like Sindhese Tamils as they use nowadays in the past, which of course is problematic, I think. Then, of course, they provide a myth or history. Here, I looked a lot at how the textbooks provide very selective storylines. They're very selective in the events they cover, also in the heroes they cover, so they focus very much on Sindhese kings, Sindhese politicians, and Tamils and Muslims feature very, very rarely, which creates the sense of a Sindhese history. Also, I put up the picture of Vijaya here, who is presented as the origin myth of the textbooks. So these sort of myths and legends of Vijaya of Dudugamunu in the textbooks are actually presented as historical fact, which of course is a whole issue in itself. And lastly, the role of Buddhism, which is very important for the textbooks, and again is a major driver of exclusivity, I think, whereby Buddhism is not only constructed as part of national identity, but it's also seen as the source of what it is to be good, and it is seen as the only legitimate source of sovereignty, of rule. And I'm following a quote here, whereby, in a not so subtle way, the textbooks tell the students that, well, really only Buddhists can rule the country, because Buddhist rulers, they're compared to wish-conferring trees, while non-Buddhists are seen as poisonous trees, sending a very strong message, or very clear message, that really the only people who should rule Sri Lanka are Buddhists. Similarly, the tooth relic is quite an important recurring motive throughout the textbooks, which is seen as the symbol of royalty, but again, of course, it's very Sindhi-centric, not inclusive symbol that's presented here as the major source of political legitimacy in the past, and by extension in the present as well. That brings us to the question, so if the nation is primarily Sindhese Buddhist, what about others? And I mean both external others, that includes particularly the European colonizers, which of course feature heavily throughout history textbooks, and also internal others, and that's where the minority communities come in, Sindhis and Tamils and Muslims in particular. And I was a lot more interested in the second category, because of course it's important about questions of integration and so on and so forth. In general, what we can say is that when we talk about representation of others in the textbooks, we talk mainly about the lack of any kind of representation. There is very little on or about Sunnis and about Tamils and Muslims that the readers learn in these textbooks. As I said, because of the selective histories, they simply feature not very much. But when they do feature, two elements should be highlighted. The first is that quite often the otherness of non-Sunnis Buddhists is emphasized. So I brought this quote, which again continues from the Visayan myth, where the Aryans were the first to arrive in Sri Lanka. So it establishes them as the sort of original inhabitants. And then later, Sri Lanka experienced the influx of other communities who are often then linked to troublesome behavior, linked to the Indian invasions, South Indian invasions. So they're seen as strangers, as outsiders, as basically not full part of these or Sri Lankan nation. Then, of course, we have instances of implicit and explicit negative depictions. I make a strong case, or I think it's a strong case, that the depictions of South Indians in the textbooks, which there are a lot more of than about Tamils themselves, that because of the close links that are assumed between the South Indians and the Tamils, that negative depictions of the South Indians would perhaps by many readers be taken as negative images of the Tamils, and there is quite a lot of Indians are basically invaders and have been, throughout the history of Sri Lanka, have been very detrimental to the country. And then we have more implicit negative depictions, and I brought here the quote about King Sri Vikramarajasinghe, who is quite noticeably because he's the only Tamil leader or Nayakar leader who we learn quite a lot about in the textbooks compared to all other Tamil leaders. And his story is basically the story of how he became quite a brutal, vicious leader due to mainly his alcohol addiction. And he's quite important because he was the last ruler of the Kandyan kingdom before it was subjugated by the British. So it was basically a non-Sinhalese, non-Buddhist leader who lost the independence of the country, according to the textbooks, which of course adds to the ideas that the readers should have about non-Sinhalese, non-Buddhists and their ability to rule the country. So briefly, how does this how does the end of the war fit into this kind of past? Now, Mimi was talking about memory in probably more microcosm. I'm talking more about the sort of official versions of the end of the war, and Uyangoda kind of talked about this conflict between the peace of the vanquished, as it's perhaps felt by the Tamil communities after defeat of the LTTE, versus the victor's peace, which is driven and perpetuated by the Sri Lankan government. And this sort of official version, which I think very problematically is framed within the same space as the conflict, for example, between Dudugumumu and Ilara, is of course very problematic when it comes to the space that's created or that is closed after the end of the war for reconciliation, for political reform, because it is a victor's peace that tells us a lot about the remembering and forgetting from the majority community's perspective, limiting the space for other communities to add to the end of the war as a historical moment, and this might actually become official history. So I looked a bit at how this exclusive memory comes about, not in the textbooks, of course, because they don't cover any history after 1972, which in itself I think is interesting. They completely gloss over the conflict and the war as such. But we see after 2009 in the official discourses, which are full of the same historical narratives that the textbooks also perpetuate, the historicity of the victory. So, as I said, the victory is framed within the continuation of 2,500 years of history and these ancient struggles between Tamils and Sinhalese, as opposed to, the actual struggle between the LTTE and the government. The strong triumphalism, which of course is part of how the victory is framed, and the victimization of the Tamil community, importantly, in these narratives, not as a victim of repressive politics of the governments over decades, but as a victim of the LTTE, with the government having been the liberators of the Tamil community which I think seriously limits the space in how far the Tamil community can express their grievances, as opposed to the victors who are seen as this benevolent, well, we saved you and you shouldn't really complain kind of way. So, to conclude, again, this question of whose history do we talk about? I think most of all the textbooks really present a grand failure of this vision of, as it's expressed by the Ministry of Education, whereby the textbooks should provide this tool to present or to construct a national cohesion, national integrity, national unity, harmony and peace. So all very positive, very grand goals, but as long as the vision of nationhood itself is very limited towards the Sinhalese, of course the textbooks can't really do that. Instead, what we see is that the memory of the Sri Lankan nation is dominated by the Sinhalese, and it effectively marginalizes and silences minority communities both in the past and the present, because myths and legends are continues to be presented as facts, as truths, instead of fostering a more critical engagement with history that provides space for all communities to participate in the shaping of history. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, I think our last speaker, Guru Paran, is going to be talking to us, I believe, via Skype. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Please go ahead and present.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this session. I'm sorry that I can't be present in person at this very important conference. I very recently had a look at the list of speakers who've been at the last conference in 1999, I believe. So it's an honor to be speaking at this conference. I also apologize for not having listened to the previous speakers, and hence that I'm not able to pitch my presentation in the context of what has already been said, and I apologize for any repetition that might occur in my presentation for not having listened to the previous presentations. I must also offer one more apology before I start, which is that my presentation, I know that I'm sharing the panel today with very eminent scholars, but my presentation today would be from an activist perspective, thinking about it like an academic. So, so it will be more of it'll be prescription. It'll be prescription heavy, so to speak, towards the end at least. And so, if I could be pardoned for that. The topic that I've taken, as you can see in the program schedule, looks at trying to contextualize the right to self-determination in the post-war context. and I want to push forward this idea of how the right to self-determination in the post-war context needs to be experimented through what I call the parallel state idea. Let me begin by offering some context with regard to where I think the right to self-determination of young people is positioned in the post-war context. Now, as you know, the constitutional assembly process towards drafting a new constitution hit a roadblock with the local government election results in January. And despite what Minister Mandra Samaravira might say, particularly what he said in Parliament, that the reform process is not yet dead, and that the process will continue. For all intents and purposes, it does look like the constitutional process won't move any forward. In fact, some of us actually fear that if the constitutional process does move forward, that the UNP particularly will be interested in appeasing the single majority a lot more, and might not even agree to the very little that you find in the interim constitution. Now, I don't want to take the time by offering a detailed analysis of what is there in the interim report of the steering committee of the Constitutional Assembly that put its report out in November last year. But to say that there is absolutely no, if you read the document, and particularly, and I urge for those who are trying to understand what is there in the interim report of the Constitutional Assembly report, to read the annexures where you find the different political parties commenting on the interim report. It is very clear that particularly the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, both the wings, both under whatever is left with Maithripala Sirisena and Mahinda Rajapaksa, do not want to move away from a very hardcore understanding of what a unitary state constitutes. So even before the local government elections, for me, the constitutional process was going nowhere. And the problem is that the Tamils are being trying, the pressure is on the Tamils to compromise. Right? The do-gooders on the part of the international community, the Colombo civil society included, want the Tamils to compromise and understand the fact that those do-gooders, in their perspective in the government, won't be able to do much because of pressure from the singular Buddhist vote base. So today the debate is not even on federalism. Today is the interim report is really a debate where the Tamils are being asked to take up a form of a unitary state and experiment with it in the name of a political solution. I think we need to be very careful about that. But we are living in a situation where the discourse is definitely not internal self-determination. The discourse is not definitely federalism. The discourse is about how you make sure that the Tamil demand can be put within a framework that of those whom the international actors in the South prefer, by which I mean the UNP and the current ruling dispensation. How do you reorient the demands of the Tamil people to fit within the narrative of those actors in the South, the international actors support for various reasons, including geopolitical and otherwise. Now, so really on the question of self-determination, there is very little progress, and there is very little expectation that we can have for any sort of progress internally within Sri Lanka. Now, you turn to the accountability front, accountability and justice. I have right from the beginning characterized the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government's approach to accountability issues and transitional justice and reconciliation matters as a foreign policy management issue. It has always been a foreign policy management issue for them, not really an issue that they take to heart as an integral part of an agenda that they perceive for a future inclusive and accommodative Sri Lanka. So it's no surprise that really nothing has moved on the ground except for the prolonged establishment, delayed establishment of the Office of Missing Persons, which in itself is a structure that is fundamentally weak. Because if one reads like I do Resolution 31 of the UN Human Rights Council Resolution of 2015, I think the resolution speaks of a hybrid process, not just a hybrid court, but also a hybrid process. And in that sense, any institution, any transitional justice institution that is set up in Sri Lanka must have hybrid nature to it. It is to be credible at all. I mean, the Tamils have been demanding for international investigations, but even if there is an OMB, so some of us, in fact, went before the consultation task force, went before different consultations organized by the government, and argued that the OMP must have some international involvement. It's completely brushed away, and now you have an OMP that is established with some good people whom we are asked to trust in, and you also have then people who have served with the Sri Lankan army also the OMP. So, but even then, except for the OMP, there is nothing that the government has to show, and again, we won't see any progress on accountability and justice issues. And to be very frank, I think Geneva is frozen. The Tamils must realize that, and I've said this in the past a number of times, both in the homeland and abroad, that the approach that the Tamil activists have taken, where we have spent so much of energy in Geneva, is really not working. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be putting efforts at lobbying and advocating our position in Geneva, but I think on the accountability front, that we've expended our sort of energy almost entirely, almost mostly towards Geneva. That we are probably now finding it difficult to identify alternative pathways through which this struggle can be taken forward. So if that is the situation, I'm happy to answer any sort of questions about these very summarized questions that I've taken on these two issues. There is really no movement, and there is no real prospect for any further movement on these issues. So how should Tamils deal with the situation? And I think here we need to look at the recent results, and I think the local government results tell us an important lesson that we all must be very that we must learn from. Now, for example, if you compare the votes that the Tamil nationalist parties, by which I mean the Tamil National Alliance, the Tamil National People's Front, and the TULF, which included Suresh Premachandran's EPRLF, got, there was a reduction of at least 8% of votes that these parties collectively got compared with the general elections. And if you look at the eastern province, there's been a reduction of at least 9% of vote share. And if you carefully look at it, in Kilinochchi and Mullatthivu, so for example, the general election of 2015, the vote share of the Tamil nationalist parties, the TNP or TNA, and Suresh, of course, was with TNA at that time, was 79% of the vote in the general elections, and it has come down to 54%. So that's a loss of 25% of votes for Tamil nationalist parties in Kilinochchi, a loss of 22% of votes from 72% to 50% in Mullatthivu, and in Mannar a loss of votes from 58 to 39%. Now, collectively, Kilinochchi, Mullatthivu, and Mannar are called the Manni electoral district, and this was the theatre of the last phase of the war. So what is happening? I mean, this is where I think Tamil nationalist activists and political parties, we have to be very careful that if our self-determination narrative, if the kind of self-determination narrative that we are pursuing is not delivering results, if people are not hopeful that the kind of path that we are continuing in terms of self-determination is not leading with results, and where this very strong hegemonic narrative of dichotomizing survival and self-determination politics is being pursued, I think if parties that are interested in self-determination, if Tamil political activists and parties that are interested in self-determination, they need to rethink their agenda of self-determination in the post-war context. And this is why I have, in the past as well, emphasized that we need to look at how we reorient our policies so that Tamil self-determination politics responds to the dire need on the ground as well. Now, for this, I think, and I'll come. I know that the conference itself is running a little late, and I myself don't have much of time. So let me throw this idea out, and then probably, if there are people who are interested in this idea, engage with any questions that you might have. I think, given that a political solution, a form of autonomy will not be forthcoming for the foreseeable future, I think we need to look at experimenting with organizational setups, which I call a parallel state. What do I mean by a parallel state? So you set up institutions and organizations parallel to the state, outside of the state structure, through which you can address the day-to-day suffering of the people, survivalist issues that the Tamil community as a whole faces, and I won't detail it out. I'm sure this audience is quite aware of the terrible plight that the Tamil people are in. And through the creation and the running of these organizations, keep the idea of a Tamil nation alive through these parallel institutions. But in a sense, I'm arguing that it should be possible to make the Sri Lankan state irrelevant in the north and east, right? And it is only by making Sri Lankan institutions irrelevant in the north and east, and by creating self-autonomous governmental institutions of our own, parallel and outside the state, are we going to address the plight of the people while pursuing an agenda where we keep our larger goals of self-determination alive. And I think this is true also in the transitional justice front. For example, we need to look at whether we initiate parallel processes of people's tribunals back in the homeland, look at initiatives that systematically and concretely preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide committed during the war, look at initiatives relating to memorialization. So, for example, I was in a conversation with a wide cross-section of civil society organization and student movements here about by the next year, at least for us to start on a program that looks at institutionalizing memory efforts towards 18 May 2019, the 10th anniversary of the end of the war. So all of this would mean that the Tamil community needs to self-discipline its self-organization. I mean, one of the things that the LTT was very good about and that they showed through their de facto state entities and institutions that they built up is that they showed that Tamils can be good at institution building. But unfortunately, outside of the LTT, and if you look at the post-war context, the way in which we dealt the last 9 years, institution building is definitely not something that the Tamils can be proud of. So I think there is a lot that we need to invest in institution building on a wide, on all sorts of subjects, from fisheries to agriculture to memorialization initiatives, and connect these organizations in a way. And if people are looking for a parallel for other societies that have done it, take for example in Kosovo between 1988 and 1992, when Serbia abolished autonomous institutions that were there in the former Yugoslavia, they managed to run parallel institutions that supported their own schools, their own education, their own healthcare, so on and so forth, by setting up these parallel institutions in support of the Albanian diaspora spread around the world. And again, a more recent example is the Kurdish initiative. Now, Ken Ross has written extensively about this, about how small democratic assemblies in Kurdistan are being experimented as local level, a small scale sort of democratic assemblies through which we appropriate self-government to ourselves without wasting time with the larger state trying to deliver us with self-government. We take our own sort of steps towards establishing that space for self-government. And I think it is only through that sort of initiatives which are linked to each other, which are driven by a larger narrative and philosophy, that we can keep the hopes that the Tamils will be able to exercise the right to self. So the argument that I'm making today is that the Tamils need to step forward, step outside the box in a sense, and think about the right to self-determination outside the nation-state context. Now, outside the nation-state context here doesn't mean a separate state. Right? It can mean a separate state. I'm not ruling it out, but I'm saying that it should be possible through this parallel state idea that I'm proposing to think about ways in which we self-determine our own affairs through institutional collaborations, institutional imagination outside and parallel to the Sri Lankan state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guru. Would it be okay for you to stay online?
I'll
Q&A?
sure.
Can I
Sure.
ask Peter and Mimi as well just to come up to the stage? I don't know how much time we have for Q&A. I have a number of questions for all of the speakers, and we'll
Thank you, Dr. Rampton, and the panelists for that wonderful session. We've got a couple of announcements.
So there will be a screening on Sri Lanka's Disappeared, which will take place at 6 p.m. It's a documentary by Vinorsen Ravindra Kumar, production company 47 Roots. So அதாவது இங்கிருந்து ஒரு இளைய சமுதாயத்தை சார்ந்தவர் ஒரு ஆள் இங்க வந்திருக்கிறார் லண்டன்ல இருந்து. ஸோ அவர் 6 மணிக்கு அவர் ப்ரொடியூஸ் பண்ண ஒரு டாக்குமெண்ட்ரி இங்க காட்டப்படும். அதாவது ஸ்ரீலங்காவில் காணாமல் ஆக்கப்பட்டவர்கள் அந்நிய நாட்டில் இருந்தாலும் எங்களோட மண் வாசனை விட்டு போகாதன்னு ஒரு எக்ஸாம்பிள் தான் அவர். ஸோ அவருக்கு சப்போர்ட் ரொம்ப முக்கியம். நீங்க கடைசி வரைக்கும் இருந்து 6 மணி வரைக்கும் அவரை சப்போர்ட் பண்ணி இனி வரப்போற சமுதாயத்தை நீங்க தான் வளர்த்து விடணும். ப்ளீஸ் 6 மணிக்கு முன்னும் இவரை போல போயிடாதீங்க, கடைசி வரைக்கும் நில்லுங்க.
I'll be just going to the pub to make sure everything is ready for you guys when you get there. We have another session which is about to begin with Francis Harrison chairing it. But before we get to that, maybe we can take 5 minutes? 5 minutes break. That's 5 minutes. Punch, 5, Anju, Sank.